What?
Sure. So again, my name is Elizabeth Crone. I'm here visiting family in Maryland, and I come back and forth at least several times a year. For a while, we were doing research comparing Baltimore checker spots in Maryland and Massachusetts. I was a professor at Tufts University from 2013 to 2022, and then I moved to California this year. So, which, as you'll see from our butterfly counts, was a bad move from a climate perspective. So I think the story of, and I will also say I'm really honored to meet all of you and to be here. And I'm probably also a little humbled because I'm an ecologist who works with butterflies and bees and wildflowers, which means I know a little bit less about any of those things than someone who only studies bees or only studies butterflies or only studies wildflowers. And I think the story of this talk is that someone from our working group was asking around for information about the NABA butterfly club counts, and that led to a request for someone from our group to give a Zoom talk about it. And I was like, well, I have big plans when I'm visiting my family this week, and it happens to be a meeting week, so I'll just show up and meet you. So I'm here. And this is a work in progress. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk to you. I have some notes and tell you what we're doing because our results are preliminary enough that I didn't want to put them in slides. And I actually asked Matthew, I'm like, you sure you don't want to hear like a fancy polished talk about checker spots or other buddies? Like, no, we want to hear about this project. So how many of you have been involved with NABA 4th of July butterfly counts? Oh, I don't know who's doing them in Maryland, actually. So I know how to get involved in Massachusetts.
One of our members, Rick Borcheldt, is doing the one that's up in Harford County, I think, but I don't know about the others.
But if you wanted to get involved with them, look up NABA, N-A-B-A, and don't let them send you to NBA basketball, 4th of July butterfly counts, and it will say on that website how to get involved and find a count near you. And they even have instructions for starting a count if you want to do it, with the caution that, if you start one, you should be committed to doing it in the long run, not just doing it 1 year and then getting bored. So if you haven't, how many of you have heard of 4th of July butterfly counts? So at least some have heard of it. How many have heard of Christmas bird counts? More people. So I think the 4th of July butterfly counts were started a little bit in response to the Christmas bird counts, knowing that we're learning a lot about the status of birds throughout the country, but wanting to learn about butterflies. And some of them were started in the 1970s, but more and more have been started through time. I think by the 1990s, we had a considerable number of these counts around the country. And of course, how many of you have heard concerns about insect declines and changes in insect abundance? Pretty much everyone. So what we wanted to do is put together data, not only from these NABA 4th of July butterfly counts, but from some other monitoring programs. I've worked a lot with the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, which has organized club trips throughout the summer. And they're mostly retired scientists and engineers, or at least enough of them are, that they enter all the counts of all the species they see on all their trips throughout the summer in a database. And we've worked with them to analyze that. And if we have time towards the end, I can talk more specifically about Massachusetts. So we have those detailed data from Massachusetts. In Ohio and Illinois, there have been people since I think the 1990s walking transects and doing pollard walk style counts of butterflies. How many of people have heard the word pollard walk before? So a pollard walk is something that butterfly biologists, probably in England, started, where you walk a fixed route through a site, perhaps every week or every month throughout the summer, and you record what butterflies you see. And the reason you might do that rather than going to one site once and making a count is because butterfly abundances are inherently variable in time within the year, right? So you might have one species out in spring, other species out in summer, other species out in fall. And if you go out just once a year, even at the 4th of July, you won't catch everything. So some community science, citizen science groups in the US have started doing these British style pollard walk counts throughout the country. So we have these data, especially from Ohio and Illinois, where for some reason people were inspired to start in the 1990s, but more and more states have been starting. I think there's some in Colorado and Virginia. I don't think there's any in Maryland, but if any of you have heard of it, correct me if I'm wrong, where people go there. every week. And so we have those data, and then there's one guy in California who, in some ways, I may have replaced in my department, who his name is Art Shapiro, who from the 1970s to even now, when he's in his late 70s, has walked a set of transects from San Francisco to Lake Tahoe, so across a very narrow part of California, every couple weeks from the 1970s to the present. So, yeah, no, that's the Shapiro butterfly data are unlike any other data, and I will not fill his footsteps or whatever the word is. So anyway, we have these different data sets about abundance of butterflies through time, and I wrote some notes, so I didn't just ramble about this. So I think I should open them up. So the idea was to use these data to assess the status and trends of butterflies in the US. And one tricky thing that we have to check ourselves on is that we're not quantifying declines, we're assessing status and trends, because maybe some species are increasing. And in fact, spoiler alert, some are increasing and some are declining throughout the country. So we have these different data sets, and the projects we're working on now really address two fundamental lines of inquiry. And the first question we're asking is, how representative are these data of the changes in the landscape in the United States? Because it's not like someone went out and divided up the country into a grid and randomly sampled or stratified sampled. It's people have started counting things where they think they're going to see them in these 4th of July counts. And then the second thing, which is kind of the headline, is the patterns of increase or decrease across the country. And both are in progress, but I'll tell you about what we're doing. So the first question is, how representative are these sites where we have data of the country? And this question was motivated in part by some early analyses of monarch butterflies in particular, where people went to places in the upper Midwest, like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Iowa, where they've been monitoring monarch butterflies and didn't see declines during the summer. But some scientists were like, oh, monarch butterflies are doing just fine, which isn't what most scientists think is true. But the response to that is that maybe the monarch butterflies are concentrating their activity at these places that people monitor, which are mostly natural areas that aren't being degraded, while the rest of the Midwest is being turned into a desert of corn, or a sea of corn, whichever you want to call it. We all eat corn. But that doesn't have habitat, so these sites are becoming less and less representative of the whole landscape. And that particularly for these 4th of July butterfly counts, that question has two levels. So one question, because for these 4th of July butterfly counts, and this is probably what Claire contacted you about, or someone here about, for the 4th of July butterfly counts, the data are representing a 15-mile diameter circle. So when you get the data from the North American Butterfly Association, you get the counts of butterflies associated with this 15-mile diameter circle. But surely people are not randomly going to the places within that circle. They're going to the natural areas where you're going to see butterflies within that circle. So what we're doing is we're trying to quantify how representative are the sites, like in terms of these NABA circles of the entire landscape, and also the places where people are doing these other kinds of surveys and butterfly trips and walks, but also within the circles, where are people going? And so if you get queries from, it's probably Claire Maffey with the Fish and Wildlife Service or others about where you're walking, that's why we want to know.
That's exactly what started this conversation. That very question.
And if you're involved in a butterfly count and willing to share the data about where you went with our group, you might become a point in our data analysis, because those are not publicly stored anywhere. And in fact, we had many debates at our meeting whether we should, the last time this working group met in March, whether we should all just be asking our friends where they go, because we all know some people who've been on these counts. Probably all 20 people in the group have once been on a count or have been on one count. Or should we be trying to somehow randomly survey all the NABA circle monitor coordinators in all the states of the country that do them? And this is not the project that I'm involved in leading, so I'm not sure where they are on that right now. But when we say, are they representative? We're looking at sort of three axes you could call them two, of how they might represent the landscape. One is, are they representative of the climate and how it's changing? And so we've compiled a list of 12 climate variables. Should I read them to you, or should we just say their temperature, precipitation, extremes of drought, growing season length, things like that? That was actually a hard step, figuring out what 12 variables to use and not to have a list of 400, because everybody can say my favorite insect cares about, when spring starts, and my favorite insect cares about this. But luckily, some other scientists published a paper earlier this year and said, these are what we think are the 12 most important for insect populations. So we were like, okay, we're stopping with 12. So we're compiling all those data and saying, are these regions where we have monitoring of butterflies representative of trends in climate? The other thing we're interested in is trends in land use. And for that, we have the National Land Cover Database, which is maintained by the US Geological Survey, who's actually also sponsoring this project. Some of you might remember, this is really free form, by the way, so you should feel free to interrupt me. But some of you might remember that there was briefly a National Biological Survey meant to match the US Geological Survey, and this has now been folded into it. So they sponsor working groups like ours to make sense of ecological processes. So we have the climate data, which are pretty easy to find and download. We have the land cover database, which is updated, I think, every 5 years by the government. And then we need something with pesticides. And luckily, we found a woman willing to join our group, Maggie Douglas, who's at, gosh, I'm going to forget it in this moment. I should have written it in my notes. A small college in Pennsylvania, probably only about an hour's drive from here. Maybe she can come visit you sometime. Has been involved in developing an index of pesticides from the perspective of an insect. So what her group has done is worked with studies of honeybees, because that's the insect we've studied in relation to honeybees, to find the lethal dose of different pesticides for honeybees, to compile them from the literature, and then weight all the pesticides used on the landscape relative to their lethal dose to a honeybee. So it's a one synthetic index of pesticides that we've mostly been working with this working group.
I'm going to ask you to send me her contact info later.
Yes, I will. She'll be like, who is this person?
That's what everybody's doing.
And I'll look up where she is too. So we have these 3 kinds of climate variables. And then we're asking at 2 scales of representativeness. So do the NABA circles and other sites we monitor on the landscape have typical climate, land use, and pesticide variables? And do the sites within circles that we survey have typical land use, pesticide, and climate variables? So the preliminary results that we have are that the sites are pretty representative of climate trends, at least within the regions where we have sites. The sites are representative of the climate trends. Even these big 15-mile round NABA circles that you can get from the North American Butterfly Association are not random sites on the landscape. In fact, I believe they tend to underrepresent agricultural areas already at that 15-mile scale, at least in the Midwest. The Midwestern states.
Go there, right? You can't walk through somebody's cornfield.
Yes. No, that actually, this is not a critique of the way these data are collected. That's kind of a good question, because maybe it sounds like I'm being critical of the volunteers collecting these data, but that's not the person I'm being critical of, if anyone, is the academic ecologist like me, who downloads the data and analyzes them for a trend and says, they're not really declining, everything is fine. When really the sites that are being surveyed don't represent the whole landscape. So, but this comes to some of the problems of asking these questions.
Do they take that into consideration then, that it doesn't represent that an area wide enough, or?
So different people do different things. It's a little bit of the Wild West among university ecologists and how they treat it. And so that's kind of why I think we decided at first there was an ambition to try to link all these climate and land use changes to trends in butterfly populations, which quickly becomes a very hard problem. it's easy if there's one thing you're wondering about and it correlates with one species and you understand the biology of it. But it's much harder when you're trying to say for 200 species of butterflies in the United States, which land use variables are important. It quickly becomes a big headache. Well, and just an impossible problem. It's also, well, I could get into some aspects of how you interpret a trend in abundance, but maybe I'll leave that for later. But ask me more about it later. But it's also just so one question is which variables do you include? And then the other question is, how do you relate something like pesticide use to trends in butterfly abundance? Let's say you were interested in a particular species of butterflies, like monarch butterflies, and you wanted to know how pesticides on the landscape relate to abundance of monarch butterflies. Well, the most simple thing you could do is you could do a correlation of in areas where more neonicotinoid pesticides are used, do you see more monarch butterflies? Or in years where more are used, do you see more monarch butterflies? But that's not always the way biology works, because it might be that the amount of neonicotinoids you use affects the ability of monarch butterflies to reproduce. And once you have too many, you cross a threshold and populations start to decline. So there's no change in the neonicotinoids, or if you're interested in herbicides that kill their host plants like glyphosate, Roundup, there's no change in the Roundup, but the population's still declining because you've crossed that threshold where butterflies can't have enough offspring to replace themselves. So even the question of how do you relate changes in land use to changes in butterflies, it's actually easy to do when you're studying one species and you get into the details of it. But when you have all the species across all the continents, you start with these correlations, but then that's not how biology works. And so after several days of discussing how to do this, and maybe part of what I'm giving you in this talk is a window into how academic scientists make sense of these data. We decided to start with the simpler problem of just addressing this fact that it's kind of the Wild West and people treat the spatial representation in different ways. And we should, just make the point that they're not random sites and not representative. So it's been, the first problem that comes up with the larger scale analysis, like do these 15-mile circles represent the landscape, is just the data management. You can get weather data very fine scale, or land use data very fine scale, but then to relate it to these several 100,000 circles all over the landscape is a big computing problem that takes days, even on modern fast computers, to do sometimes. Any other questions about this part of what we've done? I think I've kind of rambled around it. Or anything else that I've said so far?
So it's not yet a formalized study where you have to go within certain parameters and do this and do that.
It's not.
That doesn't sound like it.
So
Just making it up as they go along.
well, so there's two parts of making it up as we go along. And actually, one of the hardest things in sort of modern ecology is that we've noticed things are changing.
Mhm.
I think if I walked in here and I said, there's no evidence that butterfly populations are changing in Maryland, I would be laughed out the door. But in fact, like when I was a kid in the 1970s, no one was thinking about climate change, almost no one yet. It certainly wasn't mainstream. And so people weren't starting to monitor things to see if they would change. And so now we see that things have changed, but if you start monitoring after the change has already happened, you kind of miss what happened. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to look back into the past. And so when the Jeff Glassberg and the North American Butterfly Association sort of started these counts, I don't think they knew climate was changing. Maybe they did in some visionary way, but they were just like, people have been counting birds for a while, it'll get effects, it would be fun to count butterflies too. And so it wasn't started with a vision in mind. And it kind of grew organically as people who love butterflies got interested in going out and counting them. So we have these data that were designed without any particular strategy in mind. And now we're almost more like detectives than your textbook scientist. Your textbook scientist lays out an experiment and collects data in a systematic way and has a very straightforward analysis to see what's happened. And that still happens a lot in ecology. But there's also the sort of detective problem, which is becoming more common in ecology, to try to figure out what the past was like so we can make sense of it. And I guess the other thing is that all of these data are collected by volunteers who go out and count butterflies on the 4th of July because they like butterflies. And I think that people who are volunteers mostly will do what they want to do, which is count butterflies where butterflies are pretty near their houses.
Volunteers ain't much for following protocol.
Fine, because actually I've been with various groups that have looked for volunteers to collect different kinds of data. And if you come up with a very strict scientific protocol, the kind that we would pay our, professional scientists and students and research assistants to do, no one wants to do that for free for 10 years. There's a reason people get paid to do it if you're collecting lots of detailed data and you're out in the heat every day. When we were looking for Baltimore checker spots in Maryland and walking through these wet swamps every day in June and getting ticks and poison ivy and everything else, not many people would do that without getting paid. They would do it once, but not every day. But if you go out one day on a sunny day near the 4th of July to count butterflies in a park, a lot of people want to do that. So, in the projects that are fun and are a simpler protocol of things people like to do, they're more likely to keep doing it. And when I worked with the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, they were already doing what they liked to do, which was to go to different parks all over the summer, or sometimes report what they saw in their yards, and send it to a listserv and enter all the data. I don't know why they thought entering the data was fun, but some of them were retired engineers, so we're doctors. So our job as a scientist was not to tell them how to change the data that they like to collect, but to figure out the puzzle of working with it. And in the case of these NABA circles, the first part of the puzzle is how representative are they? And that piece is still very much in progress, so I don't have a lot of data to give you for it yet, but I think it's interesting because it might be a little different than how you think of an ecologist working or a monitoring program being set up.
I read about a study that someone was doing where they basically asked people to report on the number of butterflies that were stuck on the grill of their car after a road trip. And that was the data they were using to track trends, which is pretty unusual.
There was a famous study in Denmark.
Was it in Germany?
Germany,
Yeah.
yes. And maybe it's been modeled in other countries about how there are fewer insects on people's car grills after driving somewhere. I don't know if people were getting volunteers for that. I would find that more depressing, seeing how many butterflies I killed than how many butterflies I could see alive in a park. But, that's part of
It's a
what.
road trip, road trip for science.
It isn't so much just the butterflies on the car, but the overall biomass that's being eliminated out of the ecosystem on a daily basis.
Mhm.
And it all contributes to the decline of ecology. It's been happening for a very long time. There's more and more cars on the road every year.
Yeah.
And there's more and more roads every year. So
That was actually one of the things that they pointed out was they weren't sure whether it was actually fewer butterflies or just the butterflies were being distributed among a larger number of cars.
well, it's probably most of it. I wanted to ask you about comparison of NABA circles to other studies. Are you familiar with Shapiro transects?
Yeah,
I'm sure, right? So Dr. Shapiro's studies have been going on for 30 years out there.
That's the guy that walked from.
yeah,
San
no,
Francisco
I
to-
think I was just talking about them before you came in.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Those are one of the data sources we work with.
Okay, good, right. And how do they correlate then with NABA circles?
So.
I think they published something. like that,
Yes,
right?
yes. So actually, what I will say is that our study was actually inspired a bit by 3 different papers that came out in pretty quick succession.
Mhm.
So there was this study done by Matt Forrester and Art Shapiro, who was a former student of Art's, who analyzed NABA circles and Shapiro transect data, which represent this tiny slice of California.
Right,
And then also just trying to control for effort the number of reports in iNaturalist counts. And they analyzed all 3 of those data sources and they saw 2 results. One is that broadly they correlated with the caveat that the data are collected in very different ways and non-overlapping regions. The other one was that butterfly populations, on average, a typical butterfly species in the western part of the US is declining by about 2% per year. And then the third one is that there are winners and losers in those butterfly counts. So that was the first study that started to motivate our group, and we have those data included in our analyses. But then there's another study where somebody analyzed these pollard walk data from Ohio, not the NABA circles at all. And they looked at trends in abundance of butterflies in Ohio. And in general, those were also declines on the order of 1 to 2% per year. But then I worked, and some of my students in my lab group when I was in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, and analyzed their data. And from 1990 to now, we didn't see declines in butterfly species. We saw that some were increasing and some were decreasing. And the big signal in the data is that species were shifting their ranges northward. So if a species like an Aphrodite or Atlantis fritillary, Compton tortoiseshell,
Check the spot.
Harris's checker spot,
And the Baltimore too.
not in Massachusetts.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In Massachusetts, the Baltimore checker spot is doing just fine.
What's the-
Let's change the name.
Huh?
Let's change the name.
You know, climate
Boston
change,
checker
when
spot,
I
yeah.
lived in Boston with family near Baltimore, I was just like, by the time I die, Boston will become Baltimore. From a climate perspective, which that ignores sea level rise and pesticides and a lot of other problems, but
Maybe
to
from
me, it was
growth
comforting.
perspective too. They're merging.
Yeah. Well, that, yeah, urban sprawl. Although, anyway, so species like Harris's checker spot at their northern range limits in Massachusetts were declining, but other species like giant swallowtails, Zabulon skipper, pipevine swallowtails, what's another one? I'm forgetting, but were a handful of other ones. Oh, we saw some southern dog-faced butterflies here and there. Those are still very rare scattered sightings in Massachusetts. But there are a number of these species that are coming up from the south. So in Massachusetts, when we analyzed the Massachusetts Butterfly Club data, with the caveat that they're probably going to the best places in the state, we didn't see declines in our data. So that inspired us to say, well, what if we put together all the species across the country and all the data sets, including not just the NABA data, but I think I went through all the data sets, I think just before you got here that we used. But anyway, all the data we could get. So Art Shapiro, who's
You
now
can pitch it on
retired.
YouTube later, Fred. I'm ready.
Oh, yes. I can also just give you a list. Art Shapiro was not willing to be part of our group. He's just retired, and I've sort of actually replaced him at University of California. I left the East Coast a year ago. But you could never replace Art Shapiro in many ways. If you've ever met him, he's a really quirky guy. He could survey homeless camps and just fit in. He's amazing. I would not survey those homeless camps. And even Matt, his former student who's now in Nevada, would not survey those camps. But anyway, so we put all the data together in one hat. And then, you know, analyzing the data is kind of a crazy mess. And maybe we can talk more about why analyzing it is a crazy mess and the problems we solved. But what we ended up doing is estimating trends in abundance of butterfly species geographically divided into the 7 USGS ecoregions. Ecoregions is too broad a word, management regions. And we experimented with finer scaled ecological division into regions, but there just wasn't enough data. And you can kind of tell when you're doing data analysis if you're trying to estimate more signal than the data has in it. And I could talk more about how we did that. So maybe I will jump to the bottom line, which is that our analysis results kind of corroborated the different studies, even when we analyzed all the data with the same methods. So I'm going to look up the numbers. I wrote them in my notes from our preliminary analysis. That's the other thing you missed, Fred, is that these are all preliminary results. So I didn't want to make slides, partly because I felt like the data might change. And partly because I thought talking informally was more well suited to informal in progress work. So this is the last page of my notes. I had so many other things I was going to say, but I'm skipping to the 7 ecoregions.
You have to come back and talk to us again.
That's, well, or I don't know how long you want me to stay. My watch has died. I could tell you about my exciting day with my niece today, but she broke her ankle and so, or fractured it anyway. So there are 4 groups of regions in the country, and in the arid West, which are the Pacific Southwest region, which is California and Nevada, the Southwest region, which is kind of Texas and Oklahoma west to through Arizona and New Mexico, and then the Mountain Prairie region, which are all the Intermountain West states, starting with Montana to the Dakotas and Nebraska. We get the same result as in the Shapiro data when we put everything in one hat and one set of methods of about a 2% decline per year. And I should say that's only over the last 30 years, although we have some data back to the 70s. There was a lot of debate in our group. If we only have 10% of our data that started before 1990, when do we start our estimate of the trends? And we decided to start in 1990. So over the past 30 years, a 2% decline per year means there's about half as many butterflies now as there were then. And that's the rate of change for an average species. You get into all these math mumbo jumbos because if like an abundant species is increasing, then maybe the total number of butterflies is increasing. That's not happening in the West. But an average species in the West is declining by 2% per year. There still are some species increasing and some species decreasing, but on average, they're declining that much. So that's group 1 of species. Group 2 of species is the East. And up and down the Eastern seaboard, there are no significant declines in the data we have. Since 1990, which all of you, when I was telling my cousins about this, they were like, what? I know there were more butterflies in the 70s when we were kids. And I was like, well, this is starting in 1990. There still are species declining and species increasing. But our estimate for the Northeast, which is Virginia and north along the seaboard, maybe with Pennsylvania thrown in, is about a 0.5% decline per year. So over 30 years, we're seeing about 85% of the butterflies now that we were in the 1990s. So 15% decline. So noticeable over the last 30 years, but not scary noticeable. And in the Southeast, our estimate is a typical species has been slightly increasing through time. The 0.2% increase per year, which means over 30 years, there are 5% more butterflies. So not a difference you would notice, but no evidence for declines in the Southeast. That's group, and so in the East, there's no significant evidence for declines. There's evidence some species are declining and some species are increasing over the past 30 years. But in these data, there's no signal of a decline, with that caveat that these are at the best sites where people go count butterflies. In the Midwest, we're getting declines of about 1% per year. So we have about 75%, 25% decline, now about 3/4 as many as there were in the 1990s. And in the Pacific Northwest, there's not enough data, so we don't really know what's happening. But some monitoring has started. So, this points to, it might make you feel skeptical about the data because maybe you've seen declines and you know that some species are less abundant now than they used to be. Or it might make you skeptical about the time frame since the 1990s. But I do feel like the East Coast is kind of lucky in terms of its butterflies, because I do think I think the difference between the East and the West is real, even if we're underestimating the rate of average decline. I think in the eastern part of the United States, the end of the growing season is determined by the cold winter. And so growing seasons are getting longer. They're getting a little bit hotter. There are species like perhaps Baltimore checker spots that are suffering from heat waves during the winter during diapause. But there is also a nice corridor where tropical species can come up through Florida and Cuba, corridor not in a strict biological sense, but in the sense of if you fly just a little bit more further north, you can reach, you being a butterfly, habitat that is a little bit like what you would have experienced, in Maryland 10 years ago. If you go up to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the climate is not that different. And similarly, for a butterfly that used to be in North Carolina, if they are able to move a little bit further north, then they're able to find similar climate now in Virginia or Maryland. In the West, And also longer growing seasons for some butterfly species. We see this in our Massachusetts Butterfly Club data. For butterfly species that are able to have multiple generations per year, that usually gives them more opportunities to grow and helps them grow more during the summer and potentially benefit from climate change. And I see some frowns on some of your faces. And that might be because this doesn't match your memory of changes over longer time periods. Because it also doesn't match our memory of what we used to see in the 1970s, and we're only analyzing back to the 90s. But I do think that there's something to be optimistic about, which is that if we can keep habitat for butterflies in the landscape in a place like the East, if we can have flower gardens in our yards, not just lawns, if we can minimize pesticide and herbicide use in gardens and farms, butterflies have a fighting chance in a place like the East. So now I moved to California a year ago, and from a butterfly perspective, that was a big mistake. Because I think in the West, the end of the growing season is usually driven by drought. And growing seasons are not getting longer, they might be getting shorter. I mean, a lot of weird things are happening with precipitation in the West. You probably heard all the headlines about floods this year, and yet record high hot heat in the summer. So
Turning up bodies in Lake Mead that have been there for 60 years.
yes, or do you guys know about the Ghost Lake in California? The Ghost Lake, Lake Tulare.
Oh.
There's a lake, I don't know if you've heard about on this on the news, that usually isn't there, and people had built their houses and farms there, and then it reappeared with all the rain we had this year. One of my students and I out in California, we're going out to survey monarch butterflies. We're like, we have to take a detour to see the Ghost Lake because who knows how long it will be there. They say it might be there for years. And, you know, I mean, the people got moved out and I don't know where they're living now. I mean, from a human perspective, it's really scary. I mean, that's one of the scariest things about climate change. We can worry about butterflies. We can also worry about where are the displaced people going to live. That's a little bit off topic of this talk, but
with Miami.
yeah, or you know, parts of Boston where I used to live until a year ago. But yeah, I mean, you know, there are things to worry about, but it was also fascinating to see this lake reappear. Even so, I think summers are getting longer and hotter, and summers are getting shorter and growing seasons are getting shorter. The dry season is getting longer and hotter. It's getting more like a desert. So that's problem number one in the West. Problem number two in the West is that we don't have these uniform gradients of climate when you go from south to north. So in the West, we have, you know, moderate temperatures on the coast. There's a little strip along the coast, whereas you get north, you get warmer. But then you have the interior, which is really hot. And that's a different climate gradient. And then you have a bunch of mountains with their own climate gradients, and altitudinal migration works for a while, but then you run out. You know, going along the East Coast, you can keep going until the tundra is, you know, the Arctic lands are suddenly habitable. I mean, in an extreme case, but so it's really a lot. The topography is more complicated, and it makes sense to me that this is a much less robust community to climate change. So whether you believe the no significant declines in the East and 2% in the West, that has a lot of uncertainty, and those numbers might even change as we finalize the analysis. But I think the difference between the East and the West is real. And then that leaves the middle of the country, like why isn't the Midwest and the perhaps interior Southwest like Texas acting like the East, because they have the same climate gradients. And our best guess, although we haven't put together these numbers yet, is that there's been a lot more land use change in the last 30 years with industrial intensification in the middle of the country. So that's kind of the picture we're seeing as we're putting these data together, with the caveat, I was looking at you because you were asking me about it, with the caveat that these data are monitoring in most of the best places where butterflies occur. So
There's a question in the chat. They want to know, are you studying the effects of non-native and invasive species on butterfly populations?
not as part of this big working group. So this big working group is putting together all these data sets and putting together you know, data for 200 butterfly species. And there's not data at the right level to look at invasive non-native species there. I'll say that I personally, this kind of study that I'm talking to you about today is not my bread and butter. The thing that I do most often is I go out in the field and I work with butterfly populations and manipulate particular things. So, for example, when we were studying Baltimore checker spots in Maryland and Massachusetts, one of the biggest differences, I think I said maybe earlier in this talk, or maybe to some of you as you were walking in, is that in Massachusetts, it's easy to find Baltimore checker spots next, living in wetlands next to abandoned sort of town commons that are now managed for conservation and light recreation and wildflowers. In Maryland, when we came down, we were interested in a lot of things differing at the trailing edge in the center of a species range. When we came down, it was hard to find populations on public lands at all. And we worked with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources to find places where they'd been reported. And they were usually on the scrappy corner of someone's farm. So instead of having an upland meadow managed for conservation next to them, they had a cornfield. And so the biggest difference we noticed between Maryland and Massachusetts, other than the obvious climate differences, was that in Massachusetts, there was always meadows full of nectar plants for Baltimore checker spots to feed on. And in Maryland, there was maybe 1/5 as much. It was about 5 to 10 times more nectar plants per site, per meter squared, and the sites in Massachusetts as in Maryland, which I don't want to diminish the problems of climate change, and maybe we're reaching the thermal tolerance of the Baltimore checker spot in this part of the state. But I also think we did some lab experiments, and if you don't give them nectar as adults, they live about 20% less long, and that decreases the probability they can fly to another site if there's another site there. And so in terms of non-native plants, in this particular case, the checker spots happily used multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle and purple loosestrife, which is more in the north where they occurred. But the absence of native plants and wildflowers was one of the biggest things getting at them. And I think another study we did with a related database, another sort of big data study, is my collaborator Cheryl Schultz, as part of this working group and some other funding we had, put together species-specific monitoring of at-risk species where they occurred. So all the data I was talking to you about just now with the big study and the 2% declines, those are for the common butterflies that are abundant enough to analyze in these NABA circles. But there's a lot of other butterfly species in the US that are at risk and endemic to different places and only occur in different places. And so we did a different analysis of the butterflies that are state or federally listed in places where people have, monitoring at a site where they're interested in the Fender's blue butterfly or the El Segundo blue butterfly or, the different subpopulations of Enos checker spot or anyway, Mardon skippers. I don't know, I could keep naming at-risk butterflies. But in those sites, the interesting signal is that there's a pretty strong and statistically detectable correlation between how intensively the sites are managed and whether the butterfly populations are increasing or declining. And sites that are more intensively managed for butterflies, habitat management, are likely to be increasing. That's good news for managers. We're doing the right thing. It's not rocket science to scientists. And sites that don't get much management, the at-risk species are likely to be declining.
What do you mean by management?
So that is a good question. So what we did is we surveyed all the managers, who were, so usually this is something like a site that is partly being managed for Taylor's checker spot or a Mardon skipper or Fender's blue. There's a lot of this work in the Pacific Northwest. There's some Carter blue studies in the Midwest. Anyway, monitoring sites. So what we did is we surveyed the managers there and we said, how often do you manage and what do you do? And so we collected data on any kind of management. It included mowing, burning, adding extra host plants for the butterflies, adding extra nectar plants for the butterflies. Those were the most common things, grazing. I think that was the main set of things. And one thing we did is we just said, how often, what proportion of the years did any kind of management take place? And that was the strongest correlation. We also tried to separate out, can we detect, is planting host plants better than planting nectar plants? Is grazing better than burning? Is mowing different than grazing or burning? And we couldn't detect any signal across, 82 populations of 30 at-risk butterfly species that nectar plants were always more important than host plants, or grazing was always more important than burning. And my guess would be that every species has different threats, but that managers were pretty good at figuring out what their sites needed. So in that analysis, when people are managing the habitat for the butterflies to control, there was probably also invasive species control with pesticide, although I don't remember how that one turned out off the top of my head. But, what the most important thing was that managers were paying attention to the habitat at the site. And we didn't detect a signal of any particular kind of management being best for all butterflies across, all at-risk butterflies across North America, but maybe that's to be expected because different habitats need different things.
There's another question from Zoom. Do we know whether butterfly loss in North America is due to loss here or loss in their southern migratory regions?
So that sounds like a question about monarch butterflies, although there are a few other migratory butterflies like painted ladies. So what I know about monarch butterflies is that there are, well, really 3 populations in North America. There's migratory monarch butterflies east of the Rockies, which overwinter in Mexico. There's migratory monarch butterflies west of the Rockies, which overwinter mostly on the California coast. And there's non-migratory monarch butterflies in Florida and Cuba, and increasingly along the Gulf Coast and the California coast. We'll ignore the non-migratory ones for now because they have no winter range. And they're kind of a mystery, although we could talk about them a lot depending on how late you want to stay. But what we know in North America is that the Western monarch butterflies have been declining at least as fast, if not faster, than the Eastern ones. So we can't blame declines of monarch butterflies on Mexico because the Western ones are overwintering in California. Now, we might be able to blame declines in California or in the West on lack of management of these overwintering sites in California because they get even less conservation and are even more problematic from a management perspective than the Mexican overwintering sites for Eastern monarch butterflies. So I don't think we know for sure how much the contribution of the overwintering sites and the breeding range is. For Western monarch butterflies, I've worked on some analyses and population models for them. And our guess is that the most sensitive time of year is early spring. So not when they're overwintering and not when they're abundant in late summer, but when they've come off the overwintering sites in February or March and are in sort of the Coast Range or the Central Valley or the Sierras of California and are looking for a place to breed. And if the population doesn't make it through that gauntlet of early spring, you're not going to have them abundant anywhere at the end of the summer. And that could be the same in the Eastern population, although I've thought less about their full annual cycle here, that it could be places like Texas and Oklahoma in spring are some of the biggest limiting factors. And then I think also in the East, there's a more coordinated migration in the fall. And again, they have to come all the way through that central belt of the country and have nectar plants to eat along the way, and not get distracted into these non-migratory populations with evergreen milkweed, which is a whole another talk next time I visit. That one would have slides and pictures. That's a little bit more complete.
Milkweed is a controversial topic in this group, I'll let you know.
Is milkweed really a controversial topic?
Yes, it is.
Why?
It's complicated.
Okay. I will say that in our analyses of butterflies in the United States, the monarch does not stand out as a big. Monarchs are abundant and beautiful, so we see them, but it's kind of a typical butterfly in terms of its rates of decline. It's pretty average. So if you're worried about declines in monarch butterflies, then you have a lot of other butterflies you could learn and worry about the declines of. But there are also
There's a Disney movie about them and everything.
So if you don't mind, it's open up to talking about Maryland butterflies, since we're in Maryland here, so. You mentioned in your data that it didn't seem like there was a significant decline, but I would wholeheartedly disagree with that, and I'm sure other people might too. I've been watching since the 90s, my friend Phil here's way before that. We go to the premier places to look for things, and they're not there. Okay. Large numbers that we used to see all over the place, large numbers. Now you're seeing handfuls, maybe. And so I know there's a huge decline, and there's some species we don't even see at all. Some of the hair streaks and things like that. People get to say, oh, look, there's one hair streak. That's baloney. We used to see dozens and dozens, and we ignored them because there were so many of certain types. And then we look for the more unusual ones, which you don't see at all anymore anyway. So, you know, I'm not sure where this data came from and how it was assembled, but it seems to me that there's something omitted in that data. Maybe people are reporting the most common things. So, hey, look, they're all here, plenty of data. Or maybe that there was a lack of data from early on, as you said, but I think if you talk to former people who've collected in the decades past, you'll get a different picture. And I would stand by that. I think you'll get a completely different picture than what you've said now. So that's why I'm saying this with a little caveat, because I don't think that data is accurate to say that there's not a significant decline. And if you look at tiger swallowtails, sure, there's plenty of them around.
Yeah.
Right, especially in the second brood in August, I got oodles of them in the yard. Spangled fritillaries, sure. Go look for some other things. That's where you start drawing a blank. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to say that because I really think that should be said, and not to take away from your information, so.
No, that's actually really valuable, and it's useful to me to hear you saying that, because, well, anyway, because there are a couple different things in the data. I think I find my emotional reaction is that I'm relieved that the East is not as bad as the West, and I actually am pretty sure that's true. But I also think you're right that there's a lot of, even in our estimate, although there's not a significant decline across all species, meaning some have increased and some have decreased, the point estimate of the change is about, is a decline. And is one that would suggest that over 30 years, we're losing about 15% of the butterflies, which if you project back over 50 years or 60 years instead, means they're about half as abundant, even by our calculation, without, a significant decline. I think the other thing is that, if I'm remembering our data correctly, we had about 1/3 of the species increasing in this region and 2/3 decreasing. So you might say, well, how does that lead to an average not significant decline? It's because the ones that are increasing a lot, especially species that are expanding their ranges northward are increasing proportionately a lot in the region, but it may take them a long time to become abundant, even if they do.
It's almost like if all of the orioles disappeared and were replaced by starlings. You're not seeing fewer birds, it's just you're seeing like less diversity.
Yeah, but I also think that there are a lot of caveats to these data. And for example, I don't know off the top of my head, because I was kind of giving this talk on a work in progress without a lot of advanced preparation, how many of our data come from Maryland? And is it different somehow in Pennsylvania than in Maryland, or in Massachusetts than in Maryland, because it's all combined into one region? But it seems like, I mean, this is the hardest problem in ecology, is figuring out what things were like before we had data. And so it's actually really valuable to hear your gut reaction is, no, I go to the best sites and there's fewer butterflies.
Right. Perhaps the data collecting needs to be split up, refined a little more. So you're dealing with maybe certain species or just a given region instead of trying to combine into a big region and say, oh, in this whole area, this is the number or the percent of decline, because that could be misleading.
You probably go to the same places you've always gone, right?
Pretty much, yeah. There's still good habitats. The forest is there, the meadows, all those things are still intact.
But not,
The butterflies are missing.
but what else?
I don't know.
Maybe they're first.
Pardon me?
Maybe they're first.
The host plants are there. The habitat's still intact. So it's hard to say why. It's not a farming area, so you can't blame pesticides, right?
Well,
You
you
know,
can still blame pesticides
You
in
could,
people's
I
yards.
suppose, but
Residential pesticide levels are higher than agricultural ones.
okay, right, that's true, but I'm
It's
not sure.
expensive for farmers to use a lot of
You're asking
pesticides, but if the person with their yard is just a concern on there.
Yeah. I mean,
I was thinking maybe it was like, because if you're observing and you're an amateur, you would be like looking for the big things. Yeah, and like you're probably not seeing like the little azures or the little guys who fly by so fast you can't identify them except go.
well, so I would say a lot of the people who, like they said, are amateurs, but they're dedicated amateurs. They
I
are,
couldn't identify a lot of stuff I see because it figures, you know, and
yes.
yeah. So I don't know.
So they're pretty dedicated. I mean, I know the Massachusetts Butterfly Club well, and they have a listserv where they post what they see, and if someone disagrees with it, they have a debate back and forth, and they resolve what they think it is, and they post pictures if they're not sure. So I trust their identifications pretty well. But I also share, I mean, this is why I got into this study, because some of my colleagues wanted me to be involved in it. But I'm always worried about these big broad brush pictures. I'm a little relieved that we see kind of the same pattern as we did in the individual studies of fewer declines in the east than in the west. But I had actually exactly the same conversation with one of my cousins last night when I was telling him about why I was leaving the family to go talk to the butterfly club, lepidopterists club. He was like, remember when we were kids and we would see so many butterflies. And you know, this was the 1970s and it's a long time later now.
And the same
Yeah.
with moths. You don't see
Yeah.
moths very much.
Mhm.
Put up lights at night or something, you get a few moths. People get excited, oh, look, there's a
Yeah.
sphinx. Back in the day, they'd be like 100 sphinx.
So how many of other people have just a sense that over their lifetime, this will depend on how old you are, that you've been seeing a lot fewer butterflies?
Oh, God, yes.
I was just thinking just now, lightning bugs. Because I just happened to see some. I just happened to see a couple like before the rain, and I'm like, hey, we don't have that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But lightning bugs have a whole other thing with
Yeah.
light pollution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the lights we have in the environment. But I do think that, I mean, I am internally an optimist, or I couldn't do this for my work every day without getting really depressed. I do think one thing that's changed a lot during my lifetime is the expansion of suburbs, especially in Maryland.
Yeah.
You know, Baltimore is still half empty, but the suburbs are growing. In other places I've lived, the cities are being, you know, rejuvenated, but Baltimore is a little slow. Slower than average to be rejuvenated. And the suburbs are spreading, and there's this model of people having lawns, and we've become very good at killing everything that's not grass in our lawns. And I think if I were going to try an experiment to try to recover butterflies that's realistic, what I would do is encourage everyone to have flower gardens. And if you want a lawn, you should just, well, yeah, exactly. Let the spontaneous forbs, this is the word university professors use for weeds in your lawn. Spontaneous forbs. A forb is something that's not a grass, it's like something with a flower. Well, a grass has a flower too if you're a botanist, but things that are dicots with flowers. Spontaneous forbs. Let the spontaneous forbs flourish.
Let the dandelions go, yeah.
I've seen some signs for no mow May, and that's, I feel sort of neutrally about it, does some good things. But more important than not mowing, I think, is just letting the spontaneous forbs flourish.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is planting flower gardens. And actually, I know from my cousins who never left Maryland, or at least not for very long, that Howard County, Maryland has some of the best extension materials I've seen anywhere in the country for planting pollinator gardens and little patterns for how to plant plants in your yard and like exactly what to buy and how to plant them to make them look like a cottage garden. Have any of you guys seen this? The Howard County Extension Service pollinator garden plans? They're kind of amazing. I tried to get other states that I've lived in to make something like those. So that doesn't solve the disconnect in your head that our results aren't showing the big declines you've seen. But to the extent there are declines, the first thing I would try is not using pesticides and planting flower gardens in residential yards where there's no big cost. You know, and if you really like your bowling green for, you know, lawn bowling in your backyard, you can have a little bowling green, but if you don't, letting the little violets and clovers and dandelions go is at least a first step that maybe will work for butterflies and bees.
And if you're bay wise, your lawn shouldn't be perfect. So,
Yes.
you know, if you're bay wise, you shouldn't, you know, have a perfect lawn, so
Mhm.
it doesn't, you know, beyond having like more native plants and doing all the things to protect the Chesapeake Bay, then you're also doing that also to, you
Yeah,
know, encourage, you know, more butterflies, more animals. All around the-
and if you can't get native plants, it's still better to have flowers. Like if native plants are not at your garden store and you can't go to, what is it, Chesapeake Natives that my cousins go to, but they're only open on Saturdays.
Yeah.
We have,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
We will, yeah. But we don't have money too far.
Mhm. That's good. Any other questions or things you want to talk about?
So is there anything parallel to this that the Christmas bird count has done? Like maybe there were some papers that you read about, you know, looking at all those variables that you looked at. Is there something that they did too?
There have been a lot of analyses of the Christmas bird count data and also the breeding bird survey,
Mhm.
which I think USGS coordinates, also US Geological Survey coordinates also. And in general, migratory birds are also showing similar patterns to insects,
Mhm.
declining on average, some species increasing, some species decreasing.
Is there,
So-
it would be interesting, is there that west thing where they have more declines there? I mean, maybe, you know,
I've
maybe.
not noticed people talking about that in the West with birds,
Mhm.
but that's actually a really good idea and I should go back and look for it. Because we get a little bit isolated in our communities in academia.
Right.
And I don't know the literature on the breeding birds as well as I should.
Mhm.
That's a really neat idea.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Yeah, well, thank you all for listening. Hearing our very preliminary results.
We'll come back with the final then, right?
That's right. I'll come back in 2 years and give you the final assessment.
There we go.
That's my guess of when we'll have it all published in scientific journals.
Can I make an announcement?